All right, welcome and good evening. My name is Hillary. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the New York Transit Museum. If you are in the area, we hope you join us at the Transit Museum. We are located in downtown Brooklyn in a decommissioned IND subway station with an incredible collection of exhibits, a fleet of vintage vehicles, and programming for all ages. We are open now from Thursday through Sunday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., and you can reserve tickets on our website. We also have a gallery and shop in Grand Central Terminal. If you would like captions for today's program, please select captions at the bottom of your screen. Just make sure you click on show captions. If you don't see that option, there should be 3 dots at the bottom of your screen. And if you click on that, you'll see an expanded menu of options and you should find the caption setting there. Please feel free to use the chat to ask questions and comment. There will be time for Q&A at the end of the presentation, and I'll be collecting your questions as we go and asking them at the end. Okay, well, I'm very pleased to introduce our presenter for today. Kenneth M. Gold is Professor of Education Studies at the College of Staten Island, City University of New York, where he was the founding dean of the School of Education. He is the author of Schools In, The History of Summer Education in American Public Schools, and co-editor of Discovering Staten Island, a 350th anniversary commemorative history. And of course, his recent publication, which is also the subject of tonight's program, The Forgotten Borough, Staten Island, and the Subway. And in a few minutes, I'll put a link to the book in the chat. But for now, I'm happy to hand it on over to Ken. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Hillary. I really appreciate that all of you are here tonight, and delighted to see so many of you are interested in the topic. I guess there's really 2 topics. One is Staten Island and one is the subway. And while I imagine it's the subway that is really animating a crowd from the Transit Museum, I hope you'll indulge me. And I'm going to start talking a little bit about Staten Island before I get into the subway. But first, I want to thank Amy Raffel for inviting me, and Amy and Hillary Goldstein and other staff at the Transit Museum for making this event happen. I'm, of course, happy to talk about my book and what I've learned in any venue, but I especially appreciate this audience as being directly relevant. I'd like to start with Staten Island as the Forgotten Borough. And I just put a few comments up from the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, because this notion of Staten Island as neglected and forgotten is longstanding. Whether it's the borough president in 1915 noting that it's not getting its money's worth, or the mayor of New York sort of acknowledging that Staten Island is a stepchild of New York, or a local Staten Island paper calling the island Cinderella, or the New York Times noting that Staten Island considers itself neglected, even put upon by the other boroughs. And this moniker of the Forgotten Borough has a few functions, I think, historically and today. Primarily, it functions as a form of self-identity, right? It is how Staten Islanders view their treatment by the rest of the city. It also functions as a form of its otherness, how the island is seen by the rest of the city. And finally, there's even a bit of explanation and interpretation in it, in that it helps lay out why the island is different and how it's in fact changed over the last 100 years. And in fact, one result of this powerful form of identity as a forgotten borough is a remarkable transformation in public sentiment over a 100-year period. So in 1894, there was a referendum held in what we would call Greater New York, because at that point, New York was just the island of Manhattan. Brooklyn is a separate city. Staten Island is made up of several towns and villages and unincorporated areas, as is Queens. And the Bronx is actually kind of divided between Westchester County, and part of it's already been annexed by Staten Island. So there's a referendum on whether or not the residents of each of these areas would want to join a consolidated city of Greater New York. And you see that the overwhelming response in Staten Island, by nearly a 4-to-1 margin, is to join. And while the sentiment was popular in Manhattan and Queens, I'm not going to go into it, but the reality is that, as most historians of consolidation know, the outcome really hinged on Brooklyn, and you'll see that it barely passed in Brooklyn. Move forward almost 100 years, and there's a very strong secession sentiment on Staten Island, again, for reasons I'm not going to go into tonight. And there's a referendum on whether or not there should be a study committee to look into it. And an overwhelming 83% are in favor of studying it or considering the question. And 3 years later, when there's actually a referendum on whether or not to do it, nearly 2/3 of Staten Islanders who vote are in favor of it. The results from 1894 really beg the questions of why Staten Islanders would want to join New York City, and why would New York want it? So if we start with the latter question first, I'm putting up a picture of the harbor of New York, and that's really what is intended to be emphasized in this particular map. And it's highlighting Staten Island's location at the entrance to the harbor, and really forming the kind of the southern boundary of New York Bay. Because it's the harbor of New York that is a large motivation of Andrew Haswell Green, who is the primary mover behind the consolidation movement. The harbor was incredibly inefficient from his perspective, as well as many businessmen, with so many different local entities all having a piece of it. Now, the reality is the western part of it is New Jersey, and as part of a separate state, there's nothing at the time, though there will be a generation later, that can sort of bring New Jersey into the fold. But at the very least, the idea is to have a single municipal entity that can make commerce in New York more efficient. There's also some civic pride involved. Chicago has already attained its status as a second city, and its population is growing very, very quickly. And in fact, the previous year in 1889, Chicago underwent a municipal annexation of some outlying areas. And so all of a sudden, its population is over 1 million, and it's only about 400,000 or 500,000 people smaller than Manhattan's. So some of this is also about maintaining New York's greatness. As for why Staten Island voted overwhelmingly to join, it was not actually a mass movement, which is surprising given the referendum margins. The primary supporters for consolidation, for joining Greater New York on Staten Island, were civic boosters who articulate a vision of greatness for Richmond centered on the growth of its population, its commerce, and its industry. And these civic boosters are primarily businessmen, realtors, and large property owners who are imagining, of course, that consolidation will certainly yield to greater profits, greater values in property values, and more economic activity. But the question then remains, why would they be able to convince so many other Staten Islanders? And for most folks, it's not really about civic greatness. It is about improved public services, right? This is still a time period where it's the cities that have developed more modernized police force and sanitation departments and fire departments and school systems. And it's the outlying areas that are looking to be connected to these services. The most prominent of the local Staten Island advocates is a businessman named Erasmus Wyman. And he had already done much to reorient the center of Staten Island from its geographic location, those of you who have visited Richmond Town, it's literally located in the center of Island, and reorients it more to its strategic location at St. George, which is right here, which is the most proximate point to Manhattan. And there's not a love of centralization, but there are some frustrations with localism. And the most telling are the stories, many of which are apocryphal, but some are no doubt true, of these localized volunteer fire departments that, see smoke out in the distance and rush and rush and rush. But then before they get to the fire, they reach the end of their local town or village or their jurisdiction. And so they stop because they're not going to go into anybody else's. Wyman explicitly talks about what he hopes Staten Island will get, noting that he's interested in seeing free bridges, free ferries, a free tunnel under the bay to Brooklyn from Staten Island, and a perfect system of rapid transit around the edge of New York to supplement that now existing on main avenues. And he writes that in 1892. The consolidation process lasts nearly a decade, and it's a long story with lots of twists and turns. But on January 1, 1898, what at the time was referred to as Greater New York is established with 4 boroughs: Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, and Richmond. The Bronx will separate from Manhattan in the early 20th century and become the 5th. One outside perception of Staten Island that nearly derails its inclusion in Greater New York and is a huge factor in why Staten Island never received a subway connection is that it's seen as being too rural. Compared to Manhattan and downtown Brooklyn, of course, it is quite rural. But Staten Island, even in the 1890s, possessed many small-scale urban elements that made it not quite such a misfit in terms of being connected to the city. 3/5 of its 1890 population lives in 2 incorporated villages. It has a greater population in density and greater residents per dwelling than Queens in 1890. There was much industry, much was made on Staten Island, as Charles Sachs has noted in his work, from clay bricks to textile dyes to beer. A plurality of male labor found work in manufacturing and mechanical pursuits in 1890. And 62% of its population is foreign-born or the child of a foreign-born resident. Finally, it even has its own Irish-dominated political machine. So Staten Island gets some benefits from joining. It gets some wonderful new structures from Curtis High School to Borough Hall. It gets some municipal services, public services, particularly the municipal ferry terminal that opens in 1906, and it's linked to the city's water supply in 1907. Its localized governments are eliminated. It goes from 5 townships, 4 villages, and 29 school districts to a single entity, the Borough of Staten Island, which is identical to the county of Richmond, but it never gets a subway to connect to its own internal rail system. And I just wanted to kind of give you a sense that Staten Island already has that, yet another feature that makes it more than just a rural area. This is the Staten Island rapid transit, what we now think of as that. It underwent various organizational changes over its time. The line from Tottenville to St. George still operates. The branches to South Beach and to Howland Hook are no longer in operation. But you'll see that it doesn't cover all the island, but it covers the major population centers, which are along the coast, and those in the interior of the island. And you see even here, there's hope for a connection. But the dotted line, of course, signifies that right now this is by boat. The lack of a subway on Staten Island sends it in a very different population growth trajectory from the other outer boroughs. And take a look at these figures because the difference is really astounding. In 1890, Staten Island was certainly smaller than Queens and the Bronx, but none of them have over 100,000 people. The Bronx grows fastest and the most because it's already benefits from its connections to Manhattan, and it gets part of the first subway, reaches parts of the Bronx, and so it grows very quickly. Queens starts, its growth happens more in the 1920s than in the earlier decades, but still by 1930, it too is over 1 million people. And Staten Island is chugging along. Its population has still tripled over 40 years, which is no small growth, but it's nothing astronomical. And the argument here, and it's not a novel one, all right, most historians of, say, the Bronx or the Queens really kind of do a nice job showing how the arrival of the subway there really spurs population growth. And I'm just arguing that the converse is true, that Staten Island's growth is minimal in comparison. Now let's switch to the subway. There are multiple moments of possibility for Staten Island to obtain a subway. And I use the word possibility deliberate. I in no way want to argue that it had tremendously great chances for getting a subway. There are some powerful geographic and demographic reasons why it doesn't, primarily its distance. And already by 1910, it's significantly smaller population from the other areas. But there are moments of real possibility nonetheless. As many of you know, the city's first subway opened in 1904, but the contracts with August Belmont's Interborough Rapid Transit Company, more commonly known as the IRT, were actually signed 4 years earlier, and the jockeying for expansion began even before the first line opened in 1904. There are key issues with that expansion that never really go away. One of them is, of course, the New York State limits on debt. There's a debt ceiling, right? How much debt a municipality can take on. And New York is always coming up against that debt ceiling. There's political conflict between sort of Tammany Hall and more reform or fusion elements. There's communities and boroughs jockeying for particular lines. And there's even debates over how to pay for this. Some folks would like to see a return to special assessments. In other words, you know, the people of Staten Island want a borough, want a subway, fine, let them pay for it. Rather than a general assessment, which was really kind of established as a means of building great urban projects, not all of them, but many of them, first with Central Park. In the course of my book, I highlight 6 moments of possibility. And for you subway mavens, I'll just briefly mention them. One is the subway contract number 2, the arguments over what's that going to be about from 1900 to 1902. Then there's the dual contracts, the negotiations for them from about 1911 to 1913. Then there's a period in the latter part of the teens where Staten Islanders are pushing, have their own campaign for a subway directly to Manhattan. Then there's the ill-fated tunnel championed by Mayor John Hyland in the 1920s, another ill-fated one championed by Mayor Walker in the years leading up to the Great Depression. And finally, there's a renewed effort on Staten Island for a subway in the 1930s. And again, it's never that there are great odds, but some moments had better odds than others. So I'm going to focus on the episode tonight that I believe offered Staten Island the greatest possibility. But it's not the most well-known occurrence. So I'll start with that. This is Mayor John Hyland in 1923 at a groundbreaking ceremony for a Narrows tunnel that his administration was pushing. And in fact, between 1923 and 1925, shafts were dug both in Brooklyn and on Staten Island, and $6 million spent before the project comes to a halt in 1925. And it's the one that's probably the most well-known. You see it in more history books, you see it in more museum exhibits. But I don't think it's actually has great odds. It's really more political theater than a project with prospects. So instead, I want to focus on the dual contracts. Now, I apologize for this map. I don't think you're going to be able to read it, but that's okay, because what I really want you to look at are the tentacles. The dual contract, and I'll the tentacles reaching into the Bronx, the tentacles, the lines that are going to reach deep into Brooklyn, and even, though to a lesser extent, deep into Queens. So what are the dual contracts? This is the plan for expansion of New York City's fledgling subway system by contracts with two transit companies. The idea is to bring in competition for the IRT. So one of the companies is the IRT, and the other is a new player, the Brooklyn Rapid Transit Company, or BRT, and it subsequently reorganizes as the BMT, which is the acronym that many of you probably find familiar. And prior to 1911, it is running some elevated lines in Brooklyn. The plan emerges out of a failure of what was called the Tri-Borough Plan in previous years, which first the city hoped to build itself and then hoped to entice private operators, and it fails at both. The Manhattan Borough President, George McEnany, who's a prominent reform leader in civic life, but who turned into a politician when he's elected borough president in 1909, he is the key person behind the dual contracts. And his intent is to disperse Manhattan's population into the other outer boroughs by extending subway lines into relatively unpopulated sections of them. And this purpose potentially serves Staten Island well, as it too is a relatively underpopulated outer borough. And that's what I mean by these tentacles, right? The plan is calling for lines. Bronx already has some, but they're going to be extended, and new ones added. Queens is going to get, and again, Brooklyn is going to have lines going all the way down to Coney Island, and more importantly for Staten Island, going down in 4th Avenue into Bay Ridge, where the hope is that a line from that 4th Avenue line will connect to Staten Island. Staten Island has an additional advantage besides this sort of strategic one of simply what the dual contracts were trying to do in dispersing population. And that is its borough president, George Cromwell, sits with McEnany on a key subcommittee of the New York City Board of Estimate, which is then an extremely important governance body, doesn't exist anymore. And this subcommittee is conferring with the state's Public Service Commission, which is actually the body responsible for developing new subway lines. And it's conferring with them about plans for new subway lines. So having Cromwell I guess to, quote Hamilton, in the room where it happened, is also a potential advantage. Now, the negotiations are complex. Both companies and the city agree to kick in funds to build the subways, which helps the city avoid its debt limit. The contracts specify that the city will own the lines, but lease them to the companies to operate for a designated amount of years. I believe it's 50. There's a formula for dividing profits between the city and the companies, starting with the companies getting sort of their money back, and then there's a split. And but the stance that McEnany uses to induce both companies to eventually participate, the IRT balks at one point, but sort of rejoins, are twofold. One, he's basically prepared to go ahead with one company if he can't get both to participate. And two is that for each company, he couples the building of new lines into areas that are not well populated with the building of additional lines in already well-populated areas. So again, even though there's already subway lines in the heart of Manhattan and downtown Brooklyn, which are already very congested, they're building new lines there because those are going to be money earners from the get-go. The lines out here, not so much, right? They're projected to run at a loss initially, but the hope is that coupled together, the companies and eventually the city can make some money because the lines here are believed to be incredibly lucrative based on the experience of the initial subway. The Narrows Tunnel, unfortunately, though, is not included in the dual contracts. It's listed as a possible extension in the unspecified future. And it's also not even listed as purely rapid transit. They float the idea of also running freight through it to try to make the tunnel pay. And even connecting it, making it attached to sort of the water pipelines that are going to be built also to help find funds to build it. Because the problem is for a line coming off of the 4th Avenue line is that the 4th Avenue line isn't projected to be a moneymaker for about 15 years. And so that makes the BRT not especially interested in building this right away. The IRT says it'd be happy to operate it, but it doesn't want to pay for it at all. Cromwell's advocacy for a Staten Island tunnel is actually in the appendix of a report that sort of talks about the dual contracts. And it's added, this is one of the more fascinating finds that I've discovered in the archives, where you see drafts of this report proposing the dual contracts in its forms from first draft to final draft. And the earlier drafts don't actually have anything from Cromwell. This letter to the committee in the appendix is an afterthought designed to give him political cover because he expects to be lambasted by Staten Islanders for failing to sort of bring home the bacon in this case and to make Staten Island part of the dual contracts. In fact, tunnel failure is a major issue that's raised in Cromwell's re-election campaign in 1913, and he's defeated after having served 4 terms. And that's one of the factors. Okay, I think, because I really want to save time for questions, that I'm not going to elaborate on either the Highland Tunnel. I thought I might say a couple words about that. And also the group in the 1930s, the Society for Professional Engineers, which I guess the main point I wanted to make, that I find the timing there really fascinating, that they're focused on the subways, because most historians kind of see the 1920s as that moment when the automobile kind of pushes out the subway, not so much in usage yet, but in sort of its cultural power and its sort of trajectory. So you start to have people saying, let's have a tunnel to Staten Island, but forget about the subway. Let's make it a vehicular tunnel, which is what Mayor Walker wanted. But already still in the 1930s and even a little bit beyond, you have Staten Islanders saying, no, what we really need is rapid transit. So what does the book basically argue? The structure of the book is, in some ways, it's 2 pieces. It's a kind of a community study at its opening chapter and its final chapter. And then it's a transit study in the sort of the narrative of the in-between chapters that really focus on the failure to become connected to the subway. But in the opening and the closing chapters, what I try to establish is, as I suggested earlier in the opening, that Staten Island is not such an odd fit to be with New York. It has some urban elements and its citizens want to join. But by the time that the Verrazzano Bridge is open, that Staten Island has already evolved in ways beyond just the fact that its population growth is so stunted compared to the others. It's already begun to shift towards its political conservatism. It's already become much more white than the other outer boroughs. And it's also become much more middle class than the other outer boroughs, with the possible exception of Queens. And so Staten Island doesn't begin as an anomaly in New York City, but it's transformed into one primarily by the lack of rapid transit access. That's really my thesis. And while there are signs of Staten Island's cultural ambivalence towards New York City, even 100 years ago, because it's historic, but it tilted towards embracing New York in the early part of the 20th century and towards resenting it in the latter part. And an important reminder to local activists on Staten Island and elsewhere, historically, the island's ability to forge its own destiny is severely limited by powerful neighbors and organizations, which I haven't even gotten into tonight. At the same time, there are trends that reach Staten Island with or without a tunnel. In other words, the body of water can't stop them. Staten Island, for example, doesn't avoid the deindustrialization that begins in the mid-20th century and sees the closing of many of its factories, large factories. And Staten Islanders by 1960 or 1955 still want a connection, right? They're in favor of the Verrazzano Bridge. And they don't push hard for rapid transit. Some of them want it, but they acquiesce to Robert Moses's resistance to rapid transit on it. And so this framing narrative of neglect becomes central to the island's identity as a forgotten borough. I'm going to stop there because I really, I'm glad we have a lot of time for questions, and I look forward to hearing your questions and comments. So please do share.
Great, thank you so much for presenting that history. So yes, if you have questions or comments, please add them to the chat. We do have a few questions already. First up, I can read this question from Will. He said, was it Highlands Tunnel included in the IND plans, the second system IND?
That's a great question. And the sad thing is it wasn't. So even if Highland had not pursued this, and I didn't mention the tunnel, the one that he tries to build is also a dual purpose tunnel. It's a freight and passenger tunnel. And it's really his effort to counter the fledgling Port Authority, right? When I said earlier that there's consolidation of all the New York parts of the harbor, right? There's still New Jersey, which again you see on this map. And so the Port Authority is created to really be this, bi-state entity that is can really take charge of the entire harbor. And Highland sees this. It's created during his time as mayor, and he sees it as a fundamental assault on the city's autonomy and ability to kind of chart its own course. And he sees the Highland Tunnel, his tunnel for freight and passengers, as an effort to stymie the Port Authority. So he doesn't include it in his plans for the independent subway. And I think that's to Staten Islanders' loss. Although the independent subway, unlike the dual contracts, the lines were largely built in areas that were already built up. I think there was really only one of the new lines that was going to go to an outlying area.
Great. He actually had a follow-up question. He said, isn't Staten Island part of the city's municipal water supply, which seems to be a great advantage to being part of the city? And so what made building a water tunnel so much easier than a subway tunnel?
Absolutely, it is. And they get a water tunnel. I think that it's just smaller. And then you have the building cost, but you don't have the operational deficit. Right? On Staten Island, in some ways, it was the prospect of an operating deficit that hurt much more than the outlays for building the tunnel. I would argue that it's not that it was cheap, but it was definitely affordable, especially if you did it from Brooklyn along the shortest route. So the map that I happen to put up here, I didn't end up showing you. This was the proposal for a subway in the 1930s. And you see already the question of where you build it is important, right? This is a much more expensive subway to build because it's over, it's going under a lot of water. But the idea is to have it come up at Smith and 9th Street in Brooklyn, so it's very close to Manhattan. Much cheaper versions are over here by the Narrows, but then there's a long route through Brooklyn. But yes, absolutely, the water supply is one of the things that Staten Island benefits from. And to that point, I think many folk in the outer boroughs, both historically and even today, all think that their taxes are going to, especially the middle class parts of the outer boroughs, think that their taxes are going to subsidize other parts of the city. But in reality, there's so much wealth on Manhattan that it has always subsidize the 4 other boroughs in terms of where money is coming from and where it's spent.
Okay, great. There's another question. There's a couple questions about the Verrazzano Bridge and how that kind of affected rapid transit, but there was a question about why they decided not to put rapid transit even going across that bridge.
So Robert Moses hates rapid transit. The bridge is a product of a cooperation between the Port Authority, which is largely going to fund it, and Moses's Triborough Bridge, TBTO, the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority, which is the authority that he used to build the Triborough Bridge. And he takes over the Tunnel Authority, that was a separate entity that had actually wanted to build a vehicular tunnel. Moses hates tunnels. He, you read his biography, his one really big political defeat earlier in his career, when he was at the height of his power, is over the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel. He wanted the bridge there. And it actually takes the federal government and the intervention of the Roosevelts to block it. But he just had this, orientation towards highways and cars and bridges for cars. Now, he claimed that the added cost of making the Verrazzano Bridge also include rail for rapid transit and or commuter lines was really steep, in the millions, because it would change the grade of the incline that the bridge would require. That it couldn't be as steep. So even changing it, say, from a 4% to a 3% incline would add to the costs. Whether or not that's true, I didn't investigate, but Moses has a way of making the facts serve his argument. So there are plenty of experts that are challenging him on this point. But for me, the real interesting thing is I went looking for, strong Staten Island sentiment for a rapid transit connection, and it was no longer there. I don't think that by the 1950s, Staten Islanders were so eager to have easy access from the other boroughs, or at least many of them. And the thing about the Verrazzano Bridge, is that it's really not about developing Staten Island, right? Anytime someone was proposing a subway tunnel to Staten Island, they're all talking about how this is going to lead to the development of Staten Island, how it's going to generate tax revenue for the city that'll end up paying for it because property values will go, skyrocket. No one's making that argument for the Verrazzano Bridge. It is literally about, connecting the highway system with Long Island and allowing a highway system to essentially bypass Manhattan and go up through Brooklyn and Queens to the Whitestone and the Throgs Neck.
Okay. There's a few questions that kind of cropped up kind of at various stages during your talk about why Staten Island kind of incorporated with New York rather than New Jersey, where it seems like it's almost more of a natural fit with Jersey geographically and culturally and
Yeah.
ideologically.
Look how narrow the Kill Van Kull and the Arthur Kill are, right? It's nothing. It doesn't cost much at all to build the bridges from Staten Island to New Jersey, and so that's why they get built first. It's really about historical development, and there's an apocryphal story about there being a race around the island, between sort of a captain from New York and a captain from New Jersey to see which state it would become a part of. But the reality is Staten Island is settled by Dutch from Manhattan in 1661, and so it's kind of cultural orientation from the beginning. And in fact, Staten is from the Dutch word for estate, and so a large estates are settled on the island, and so its orientation from the get-go in terms of who's coming there is with New York. I feel like, Hillary, there was a second question prior to that, and I'm realizing now that I didn't answer it, but I can't recall what it was. From the question about rapid transit on the bridge, you asked, people asked about something else as well that you mentioned.
No, I think it was just, yeah, whether they decided to put rapid transit, and somebody else, like you've noted, said probably Robert Moses didn't want it.
Oh, okay. All right, good. I'm glad I didn't omit it. Thank you.
Yeah, a few mentioned that. I think we covered most of the questions. Does anybody have any other questions? We still have some time in chat. I wonder, are there calls for succession that still kind of are raging now? Is that something that you could even imagine happening?
I can't imagine happening. It was, what happened in the 80s and the 90s that led to those referenda on secession was that I had mentioned that there was an entity that was really important in New York City's government called the Board of Estimate and Apportionment. And on that board, there were a total of 8 people sitting that collectively had 16 votes. So it was staggered in that the mayor, the comptroller, essentially like the city's finance head, and the city had it wasn't a city council then, it was a board of aldermen. So those 3, the president of the board of aldermen sat on the board of estimate, and they each had 3 votes. The 5 borough presidents also sat on it, and the borough presidents of Manhattan and Brooklyn, their vote counted as 2, and the borough presidents of Queens, the Bronx, and Staten Island, their vote counted as 1. And so think back to that population disparity, while Staten Island always felt marginalized politically, it had as much clout on the Board of Estimate as 2 boroughs that had, even by the 1980s, at least 3 times the population. And so there was a court case, I don't recall who initiated it, but it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, which ruled that, in fact, this system of governance was in violation of the one person, one vote rule. That basically areas should have a similar kind of apportionment. So New York City had to do some charter revisions that resulted in the elimination of the Board of Estimate. And as a result, Staten Island lost, a seat on the chamber, and where its vote really mattered a lot more than, the 3 votes it might have in a, 50 plus member city council. So that leads to this strong sentiment in the 90s, and it's actually just blocked by the courts. And the reality is, a city like New York or any city is created by the state. So no group of people can just choose to leave. It would need to pass the New York State Assembly and the Senate. And, Sheldon Silver, the longtime assembly leader, also, I think, blocked it. It wasn't supported either by courts or had the votes in the assembly. I haven't encountered so much sentiment today. I also think Staten Island's changing demographically. In many ways, in the last 20 years, it started to resemble Queens a lot more. Its population from all different areas of the world has really exploded. And I think that there's you see more and more members of its, second or third generation of its sort of white middle class population leaving for New Jersey.
Interesting. Let's see. We have a couple more questions. One, is the Staten Island Ferry free to make up for the fact that rapid transit doesn't quite run to the borough? And how long has ferry travel been that kind of key staple of travel to Staten Island?
Ferry travel, you know the Vanderbilt family. The operating ferries was how they the family initially made its money. So it goes back to Cornelius Vanderbilt in, I think, the 1850s. And, before there was any rapid transit, I mean, there were ferries from multiple spots in Staten Island. There was one from Tottenville down in the bottom to New Jersey. There's ferries from St. George and from Stapleton and other parts along the shore, and other ferries on the western shore. So they've always existed. They were private ferry companies. One of the things that Staten Island gained, or whether it's a gain or not, I suppose depends on your political orientation, but at the time it was seen as a gain to have the city run the ferries and not these private companies. So the city takes over the ferry operations and builds a nice terminal at St. George and buys the island 5 new ferry boats that they name after the boroughs. In, I think, 1905, 1906. And the ferry did cost money. It was probably underpriced, because even arguments about the subway, often people would bring up that, well, we're already wasting money. We're already operating the ferries at a municipal loss, which was true in some years. Let alone we don't want to do that with the subways. And, there's certainly people that remember a nickel ferry. I think it was 50 cents when I first took it in the late 1980s. But Mayor Giuliani made it free in the middle of the 1990s. And frankly, it was really, in my view, a way of saying thank you politically, because it was a very popular move on Staten Island. And if you look at the 1993 vote, where Giuliani barely beat the incumbent, Mayor David Dinkins, there was a strong vote in favor of Giuliani on Staten Island. And there was this kind of sense both on and off the island that Staten Islanders really threw the election to Giuliani.
Interesting. Wonder how they feel about Giuliani these days. There's a couple questions about kind of the changing routes that are even available on Staten Island. There's one question that asked why the North Shore route was removed. Maybe that area didn't develop ridership. And then there was another similar question that said, will any of these discontinued passenger rail lines return, because there's so little public transit even on that.
Yeah. So on Staten Island, right, we haven't talked about the buses. The buses are seen as the compensation for Staten Island, even in some ways more than the ferry, right, that it should have an extensive bus system. The challenge, and so I'll get to the lines in a second, but the challenge with the buses on Staten Island is that they're sort of oriented towards St. George, and sometimes it's very hard to get from one spot in the middle of Staten Island to another spot in the middle of Staten Island, because the bus routes aren't really oriented that way. And then there are an extensive number of express buses from Staten Island that go into Manhattan. The other 2 lines, the sort of the North Shore line here and the line to South Beach, closed in the 1950s because they didn't have the ridership to sustain them. They were operated by private companies, and then I believe, and here I may be misremembering, I believe the city does eventually take them over, but rather quickly decides that it can't turn a profit either, and then closes them. If my colleague from CSI, College of Staten Island, Jonathan Peters, were here, I'd ask him to chime in. He is a big proponent. He's a business professor, a finance professor with an expertise on transportation today. And he's a big proponent of reopening this line, the line along the North Shore, and using it to actually have light rail go over the Bayonne Bridge, because the Bayonne Bridge, unlike the Verrazzano Bridge, was designed to accommodate light rail. I know he was disappointed a few years back when they raised the Bayonne Bridge, but didn't add lines for the light rail. And of course, there's a light rail line that actually goes down to the bottom of Bayonne. But there really isn't a strong political movement for it. And honestly, at this point, I think Staten Island's population is too dispersed. In other words, what were once real sort of centers, relative centers of population on Staten Island, like Port Richmond, like New Brighton, I'm sorry about that, are, I mean, they still have sizable population, but so do lots of areas in the hinterland, in the kind of the middle of the island. So it doesn't really have the numbers. And I think its development is such that it's probably too far developed along sort of automobiles for to kind of undo that with a rapid transit line is not likely.
So you see kind of the future more toward cars than public transit?
Well, I see the economics of it, of rapid transit being really prohibitive. Cars aren't the solution to Staten Island's problems with transportation either. I mean, Staten Island, right? The subway was designed to address transportation off from the island to places off the island in New York City. But the reality is internal transportation on Staten Island is awful, in part because its roads were sort of follow old, stagecoach lines or unplanned development. At certain rush hour and at school drop off and pickup times, you don't want to drive anywhere on Staten Island because it could take, 2 or 3 times as long to get somewhere than it would if you went at a non-peak time. So, I do think that Staten Island needs to figure out something about the automobile.
Do you see a solution for some of the transportation problems at Staten Island?
Well, I think that, I think what you have to do is sort of create what scholars of the subway call the riding habit. And one thing that creates the riding habit is, of course, making other modes pricing people out of them. So, I think while it wouldn't make sense to do congestion pricing on Staten Island, I'm eager to see if it actually takes place in Manhattan and to see what that impact would be on subway ridership. There are moments on Staten Island where it's awfully congested. So from my perspective, if you institute some kind of pricing system that if you created a disincentive for people to drive on Staten Island, and at the same time, you provided more options with buses, you might see a change. I certainly would like to see, the rail line reopened, but I think it would be hard to make the numbers work.
Okay, well, I think maybe that's a good place to kind of wrap up. Ken, thank you so much for coming and presenting and sharing this knowledge and this really great history. We don't want the Staten Island to be the Forgotten Borough of the Transit Museum. It's great to kind of bring it into the fold with our programming here. So this is really great.
Well, thank you. Can I just thank the audience? Thank you for coming. And at least there are about 70 of you who did not forget Staten Island for this last hour. And I'm deeply appreciative of that. And feel free, you can Google my name and the College of Staten Island and quickly get my email address. It's kenneth.gold at csi.cuny.edu. Maybe we can put that in the chat. Feel free to, email me with any follow-up questions or conversation.
Great. I'll get that in the chat in just a minute.
Thank you.
I have a couple links here as well. Thank you all for coming and spending your evening with us and for asking such great questions. Just a couple quick reminders. We'd love to see you at the museum, so please feel free to visit. You can get your tickets online. We're open again Thursday through Sunday, 10 to 4. You can get your tickets online at nytransitmuseum.org and visit. If you'd like to support more of this kind of programming, we'd love to have your donations. You can also become a member. It's a great way to support us. We have more virtual programs up in the queue. Let you know that our next virtual program is going to be Thursday, September 21st at 6 p.m. This is Latinx art in the subway. We're going to have two artists discussing their mural installations in subway stations. They're going to be joined by Sandra Bloodworth, the director of MTA Arts and Design, and Suzanne Temkin, who's curator at Museo del Barrio. And coming up this weekend, if you're here in person in the tri-state area, we have our annual Parade of Trains event. So this Saturday and Sunday, we'll be running select vintage trains between Brighton Beach Station and Kings Highway Station on the QD line. It'll be between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. so you can hop on and hop off a variety of trains as much as you like. It's a free program. You just have to swipe or tap to get into the subway. So we hope to see you out there this weekend. Thanks all for coming out today. We'd like to thank our sponsor Con Ed for supporting our virtual programs, and big thank you again to Ken Gold for coming and sharing his book, The Forgotten Borough, Staten Island, and the Subway.
Thank you and good night.
Thanks all. Have a great night. We'll see you next time.